This bear was raised by 3 dogs and thinks he's a dog. What happens next is unbelievable. On a cold spring morning, in the wide-open silence of rural Montana, Jake stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, his coffee cooling quickly. In the brittle air, the grass still wore a thin crust of frost, and the trees at the forest edge whispered in the wind, their branches shivering in the hush. Jake, a man long accustomed to solitude, lived alone on this stretch of land. A quiet life of feeding horses, tending fences, and drinking black coffee, while watching the horizon shift with the seasons. But on this particular morning, as he adjusted his jacket collar and listened to the hush of the waking woods, he heard something unexpected, a faint growl, low and urgent, cutting through the morning stillness. It wasn't the kind of sound that came from a wounded coyote or a feral dog. There was a weight behind it, a depth that tugged at instinct. Jake's brow furrowed. He set down his mug and walked toward the sound, boots crunching over frost-hardened grass. The growl came again, weaker now, mixed with a trembling whimper. His pace quickened, breath puffing in the cold. Just beyond the tree line beneath the heavy shadows of pine and fir, Jake stumbled onto a scene that hollowed his chest with sorrow. A mother bear lay sprawled on the ground, her massive frame stilled by death, her flank soaked with blood. The wound was clean, deliberate, a poacher's bullet. There was no honor in the way she had been left. Jake's stomach turned at the waist, but then he saw movement. A tiny, trembling body curled close to her chest, barely breathing. A bear cub, newborn, helpless, fur still slick in places with birth. Its wide eyes were open in blind panic, its breath short and ragged. It made no sound now, just stared at Jake with a kind of pleading emptiness. The space beside its mother was already beginning to cool. Jake didn't hesitate. Gently he reached forward, hands steady despite the rush in his blood, and lifted the cub into his arms. It weighed almost nothing, its heartbeat faint against his flannel shirt. "You poor little thing," he murmured. Without thinking further, he turned back toward the ranch, shielding the cub from the cold as best he could. Inside, the wood stove burned low but steady, casting a soft orange glow across the floorboards. Jake laid the cub on an old woven blanket near the hearth and went to fetch warm water and towels. The door creaked again, and before he could return, 3 figures padded softly into the room. Rex, his old German shepherd with a graying muzzle. Buddy, the ever-gentle golden retriever whose tail wagged even when he was half asleep. And Scout, a sharp-eyed border collie with a twitchy kind of alertness that never quite shut off. The dogs gathered around the unfamiliar scent, cautiously circling the cub as Jake returned. But what happened next left Jake rooted to the spot. Rex, slow and stiff from age, was the first to act. He leaned forward and began licking the blood, gently from the cub's tiny fur, his movements patient and deliberate. Buddy, warm and golden as the morning sun, laid down beside the trembling little creature, pressing his body close to share heat. The cub, still shivering, instinctively burrowed toward him. Scout stood just beyond, body rigid, ears alert, facing the front door like a sentinel. Not a bark, not a growl, just quiet acceptance, as if something sacred had passed between them. Jake crouched, watching the scene unfold with something like reverence in his heart. "Kota," he said softly, almost surprised at himself. "That's your name." The word felt right in his mouth. He'd read once that it meant friend in the Lakota language. He whispered it again, this time to the cub. "Kota." The little bear didn't react, but Jake saw the tiniest flicker in its eyes, an ember of recognition, or maybe just hope. And so it began. Over the days that followed, Kota slowly recovered, fed on goat's milk and mashed fruit, wrapped in old quilts, nuzzled by Buddy's warmth. He stopped shivering. His breathing grew deeper. He blinked with growing clarity, and more than that, he began to mimic. When the mail truck arrived and Rex barked low and steady, Kota awkwardly and without rhythm let out a curious half-growl, half-howl in response. Buddy tossed a chewed tennis ball across the porch and Kota galloped after it with clumsy legs, pawing at it before tumbling into a bush. Scout sprinted across the field chasing wind shadows, and Coda tried to follow, tongue lolling, breath heaving, joy in his movement. At night, the dogs would curl together in the hay-strewn corner of the barn, and nestled among them, his body half draped over Rex's side, Coda snored softly beneath Scout's watchful eyes. Jake watched, amused and moved in equal parts as Coda even began attempting the sitting and begging posture. Awkward and stiff, but full of earnest imitation. When Buddy wagged his tail in greeting, Coda would wriggle his rear as best he could, clearly trying to mimic the gesture. The small town nearby began to buzz with talk. People came by the ranch to see the bear who thought he was a dog. Children laughed as Coda chased after squeaky toys, and the mailman brought biscuits just for him. But amid the laughter and novelty, Dr. Sarah Chen watched quietly, thoughtfully. She was the town's veterinarian, calm-eyed and precise in her words. After observing Coda for a week, she said to Jake, "He's experiencing something like species identity confusion. For him, the dogs are his first and only social mirror." Jake nodded, understanding something deeper behind her words. This wasn't just an animal acting strangely. It was a life shaped by the reflection of love. Coda didn't just live with the pack. He was one of them in the only way that mattered. And none of them, not Jake, not Rex or Buddy or Scout, questioned that truth. It was written in the way Rex licked Coda's ears when he yelped, in the way Buddy let him steal food from his bowl, in the way Scout would lie awake beside him all night long, eyes scanning the dark, guard always up. Coda was their brother, their pup, their packmate. And Jake, looking out across his land, felt the quiet certainty settle over him. This cub was no accident, no passing curiosity. He had been placed here for reasons he didn't fully understand yet, but with a purpose stitched deep into the threads of the heart. Coda grew quickly under the watchful gaze of the Montana sky, his body thickening with strength, but his heart remaining soft, shaped by the warmth of his 3 adoptive brothers. By early summer, the cub had nearly doubled in size. Yet he still loped after Scout with the awkward bounce of a pup, still curled beside Buddy at night with his broad head tucked under the retriever's chin, and still sought out Rex's low, rumbling howls to mimic with his own strange, untrained voice. The transformation was something remarkable. It began with little things, Coda learning to bark, or at least try to, when the old ranch truck groaned up the gravel drive. It was less a bark and more a deep-throated huff, but he did it with such excitement that Jake couldn't help but laugh. Every time Rex gave his signature howl, low and rising, Coda responded not with a bear's growl but with a muddled howl of his own, as though trying to match pitch and tone. It was part imitation, part pure-hearted effort. He followed, the dogs and everything. When Buddy trotted after tennis balls with effortless grace, Coda gave chase too, charging forward, misjudging the bounce, toppling over, and then proudly trotting back with the slobbery ball clenched in his massive jaws. Scout would leap to catch frisbees or dart through the field chasing butterflies, and Coda tried to match him, always a few beats behind, thudding through the grass like a runaway tractor. The ranch buzzed with this strange harmony, and Jake, ever quiet, ever observant, let it be. He didn't try to correct Coda or mold him into what nature had meant him to be. Instead, he watched as the cub learned something between 2 worlds. At night, Coda would press his bulk against Rex, now stiff in the joints and slow to rise, and breathe in rhythm with the old shepherd's aging chest. On cold mornings, he curled into Buddy's golden fur, head draped over a paw that was no longer larger than his own, and during the day, when Scout would stand watch at the edge of the field, ears perked, body rigid with alertness, Coda would sit beside him, panting and still, eyes following the wind as though mimicking Scout's every silent cue. The town couldn't stop talking. Word had spread like wildfire. Children came in cars from the surrounding counties to witness the bear who thought he was a dog. They laughed when Coda rolled over on command, when he did a lopsided sit and beg, his front paws raised slightly while his rear end stuck out at an angle. The local mailman brought special treats now, tossing them from the truck window, laughing as Coda bounded after them like a golden retriever in a bear suit. The ranch became a place of unexpected pilgrimage, a quiet miracle tucked into the prairie. But not everyone watched with laughter. Dr. Sarah Chen, calm and deliberate, stood at the fence line one afternoon, her arms crossed and her gaze trained on Kota as he ran in circles with Scout and Buddy, chasing a fluttering leaf like it was prey. Jake came up beside her, wiping his hands on a rag, the smell of hay and horses lingering on his shirt. "He's thriving," he said quietly. But Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied Kota with a thoughtful frown. "He's not just mimicking them," she said finally. "He believes he's one of them. This isn't behavioral imitation, it's identity." Jake followed her eyes. Kota was now attempting to dig beside Buddy in the vegetable patch, nose down, massive paws flinging dirt into the air. "Species identity confusion," Sarah continued. "He's using the dogs as a mirror, his only social frame of reference. To him, they're what family looks like, what belonging sounds like. He's never seen another bear, has no concept of what a bear should be." Jake nodded slowly. He'd felt that truth somewhere deep in his bones, but hadn't put words to it. Kota wasn't just living with the pups. He was living as a dog. He barked when startled. He flopped over on his back to invite belly rubs. He even awkwardly tried to wag his rear end when excited, swinging his hunches back and forth in a comically clumsy attempt at tail wagging. Would have been funny if it weren't so heartbreakingly sincere, but in the back of Jake's mind, a quiet question had begun to stir. What would happen when Kota finally met another bear? Would he understand? Would he be understood? The answer came one evening in late summer. Jake was mucking stalls when Scout let out a sharp bark, not the playful kind, but a warning. Rex stood slowly, joints stiff, and Buddy froze mid-drink from the trough. Kota bounded out of the barn, tail end swinging, ready for whatever excitement lay ahead. But what stood at the edge of the forest stopped them all. A full-grown male bear, massive, muscles rippling under black and brown fur, stood at the tree line, nostrils flaring, eyes locked on the ranch yard. Kota didn't growl. He didn't retreat. Instead, he howled, a long, strange, high-pitched sound that made the other bear blink in confusion. Kota dropped to the ground and bounced twice, like Scout did when inviting play. He barked, yes, barked, and then approached in a loose-limbed gait that mirrored Buddy's excited trot. The bear didn't understand. Of course he didn't. His ears flattened, and with a furious grunt, he charged. Kota froze, panic flashing in his eyes. With a strangled yelp, he bolted back toward the barn. In an instant, Rex moved between them, stiff but firm. Scout flanked around the side, and Buddy planted himself protectively in front of Kota. It was an absurd sight. A trio of dogs forming a shield between a wild bear and the cub they had claimed as their own. The bear hesitated, snorted, and then, perhaps confused or merely disinterested, turned and lumbered back into the woods. Kota didn't make a sound. He crouched low behind Rex, trembling. That night, the ranch fell silent. Kota stood for hours at the forest's edge, shoulders rising and falling with every uncertain breath. He growled once, deep and unfamiliar, then quickly glanced around, almost guilty for letting it out. When the stars blinked into view, he climbed the tallest tree he could and perched there, swaying slightly, letting out long, lonely howls that echoed with something new, something ancestral. Jake watched from the porch, heart heavy. He saw how Kota tossed and turned in sleep, claws twitching, teeth bared in silent battles no one else could see. One night, the cub thrashed so hard he knocked over a wooden crate, waking the dogs, panting as if he'd been running through fire. The next morning, Sarah Chen knelt beside him, watching his labored breaths. "He's exploring instincts that have been repressed too long," she said softly. "There's a whole part of him he doesn't recognize, but it's waking up." Jake nodded slowly. He didn't know how to help, but he knew he had to try. The cub who thought he was a dog was now walking a trembling tightrope between the only love he'd ever known, and a voice calling from deep within. A voice he didn't yet understand. Autumn arrived quietly at the ranch, painting the Montana hills in gold and copper. But for Kota, The days felt colder in ways that had nothing to do with the air. Since his encounter with the wild bear, he had grown quieter, less playful. His curious howls replaced by long silences and heavy gazes toward the forest. He no longer barked when the truck pulled into the drive. He didn't chase Scout or flop down for belly rubs. Sometimes he would begin to growl softly, then stop, looking around with a strange sort of guilt, as if ashamed of sounding like a bear. He spent more time alone, climbing trees at dusk, standing motionless in the high branches while the wind whispered through the pines. Jake began finding claw marks on tree trunks in the mornings and disturbed patches of earth where Coda had dug, then abandoned whatever instinct had led him there. The dogs felt the shift too. Scout barked into the darkness when Coda disappeared. For hours, Buddy whimpered softly by the barn door. Rex, old and wise, simply watched, his eyes never leaving Coda's silhouette as it vanished into the woods. One night, Jake awoke to strange noises from the barn. Frantic thrashing followed, by guttural sounds unlike anything he'd heard. Rushing outside, he found Coda tangled in blankets, massive paws clawing at the air, teeth bared, eyes shut tight in a nightmare that held him fast. Jake called his name once, then again, kneeling slowly beside him. "You're okay, boy," he whispered, reaching out a steady hand. Coda jolted awake, panting, his fur soaked with sweat. He looked around wildly, then saw Jake, then Buddy, then Rex and Scout. Slowly, the panic faded. Coda lowered his head, ashamed, and curled inward. Jake sat with him the rest of the night, silent as the bear drifted into uneasy sleep. By morning, Sarah Chen returned. She ran her hand gently along Coda's back, feeling the tension. "He's having dreams," she murmured. "Violent ones. Bears don't dream like dogs. They remember trauma, scent, fear. It's all bubbling to the surface." Jake nodded, the weight heavy in his chest. "What do we do?" Sarah hesitated. "He needs guidance," she said finally. "He needs to learn what it means to be a bear. From a bear." Jake was silent for a long moment. Then he stood, the wheels in his mind already turning. 2 weeks later, a new presence arrived at the ranch, a lumbering figure with tired eyes and slow steps, fur worn thin at the shoulders, muzzle graying. His name was Misha, a former captive, raised behind fences and concrete. Freed by a sanctuary, but too disoriented to return to the wild, Misha now moved with the grace of someone who had known sorrow and survived it. When Coda first saw him, he approached cautiously, circling at a distance. Jake stood nearby, heart pounding. Coda let out a familiar bark. Awkward, hopeful. Misha didn't bark back. Instead, he lowered his head and took a few slow steps forward, then paused. Coda approached. He barked again, bouncing slightly like he would with Buddy. But when Misha didn't mirror the excitement, Coda stopped. He seemed unsure, lost. Then Misha leaned forward and gently sniffed Coda's forehead. Something shifted. In the days that followed, Misha showed Coda a different rhythm. He rubbed his back against bark, marked territory, dug shallow dens in the dirt to cool down. He growled low, not as threat, but as language. Coda struggled at first. Too fast, too playful. But slowly, the knowledge passed from one to the other. Jake watched as Coda stood beside Misha at the forest's edge, mimicking his stance, growling low into the wind. Yet Coda didn't abandon the other part of himself. At night he returned to the barn, curled beside Buddy, licking Scout's ears, lying beside Rex when the old shepherd wheezed in his sleep. One day, something happened that sealed Coda's dual identity forever. Scout, chasing a squirrel into the underbrush, startled a bobcat. The feline lunged, claws slashed. Scout yelped, pinned and struggling. Jake heard the cry, but Coda was there first. With a sound that was neither bark nor roar, but something new and terrible, Coda charged. The bobcat turned too late. Coda slammed into it with all his weight. The predator tumbled away. Coda reared up, bellowing, and the cat fled into the trees. Jake arrived moments later to find Scout bleeding, crumpled, and Kota standing over him, chest heaving, eyes wide with fear and love. That night, Kota didn't go back to the barn. He lay curled around Scout beneath the apple tree, his massive body wrapped around the injured dog, head resting gently on his back. He didn't move for hours, even as the stars turned overhead. When Jake came with blankets and a lantern, he saw something shining in Kota's eyes. Not fear, not anger, tears. By morning, as golden light washed across the ranch, Dr. Chen stood beside Jake, watching the bear and dog asleep under the tree, breathing in perfect sync. "He's both now," she said. "He's learning to growl and bark." Jake nodded, overwhelmed. Kota had become something the world didn't yet have a word for. Not a bear trying to be a dog, not a dog pretending to be a bear, but a creature of two hearts, a being shaped by both instinct and affection, fury and empathy, something entirely his own. Winter came slowly, brushing Montana's hills with frost and quiet. The trees stood bare, the fields whispered beneath snow, and across that white canvas the tracks of bear and dog wove a shared story. Written in footprints, Kota had grown strong, tall, steady, but beneath it all, his heart remained soft, tethered by love to the family that raised him. In the months after Scout's recovery, the ranch transformed. It was Sarah who first voiced the idea, her words cautious but hopeful as she watched Kota gently nudge a nervous collie pup. "You've built something rare here," she said, eyes on Kota curled beside Buddy beneath the old oak. "What if this became more than a ranch, a sanctuary for those who've forgotten how to trust?" Jake considered it, turned it over in his hands like a smooth stone. Then slowly, the ranch began to change. Word spread, not just about the bear who thought he was a dog, but about the place where species didn't matter. They came, traumatized. Dogs, orphaned cubs, cautious, unsure. And Kota, once the student, became the teacher. He met them all with that same blend of confusion and joy. Growls answered with barks, clumsy play bows for shy cubs, protective curls around trembling dogs. There was no manual, no guide, just Kota, and that was enough. Kota carried something deeper than knowledge. He had empathy, pure, unfiltered, instinctive. A Labrador once bitten by a caged bear whimpered upon seeing Kota cowering behind a crate. Slowly, Kota approached, lowering himself onto his stomach, nudging a tennis ball forward with his snout. The dog growled softly, uncertain. But when Kota rolled over dramatically, legs splayed and tongue lolling in a ridiculous impression of Buddy at play, the tension cracked. A tentative wag, a cautious sniff, healing, unspoken. For orphaned cubs too wild for human touch, Kota offered. Games not found in any manual, fetching branches, pawing snow into makeshift dens, play fighting with gentleness that belied his size. He never lost his dog heart. Even as he learned to mark trees, dig dens, and communicate in low huffs and grunts, he still howled at the sound of Jake's truck, still chased after falling leaves, still ran in joyous circles when Scout barked at the wind. Then came the girl. She was 6 years old, eyes dark and silent, wrapped in a winter coat several sizes too big. Her name was Clara, and she hadn't spoken in 8 months. Her family had moved west after a tragedy, something Jake never pried into. Her aunt, desperate and gentle, brought her to the sanctuary on a whim, having heard about a bear who healed with play. "She's afraid of dogs, afraid of bears, afraid of everything," the aunt said quietly. "But she saw your videos. She watched him catch tennis balls. She didn't look away." Clara stood rigid behind the fence, fists clenched. Kota noticed her instantly. He ambled closer, his large paws silent in the snow. Stopping just shy of the gate, he made no sound. He simply sat and tilted his head. Then, as if on cue, he flopped onto his side with a groan, rolled onto his back with his limbs in the air, and played dead. The girl didn't move. Kota lifted his head, stuck his tongue out, and let out a long, offbeat howl, half bark, half squeak, entirely ridiculous. It echoed awkwardly across the pasture. Something cracked. Clara burst out laughing, sharp and sudden, and dropped to her knees as though her legs had forgotten how to stand. Her aunt gasped. It was the first sound Clara had made in 8 months. Kota crept forward and touched his nose gently to her mittened hand. From that day forward, she came every weekend. She never said much, but she laughed. And when she did, Kota would dance, literally bounce in place, turn circles, and wag his massive rear end like Buddy used to. The sanctuary became a place not just for animals, but for people too. Jake built benches out by the trees, spaces for quiet visits and quiet healing. Veterans with PTSD came to sit and watch Kota groom a trembling pup. Children on the spectrum found in him a friend who didn't need words. Even Sarah, hardened by years of emergencies and heartbreaks, once admitted while brushing Misha's, "This place feels like a second heart." Then came the day no one was ready for. Rex, Jake's oldest companion, his muzzle long since grayed, his steps stiff with age, lay beneath the porch, breath slow and shallow. Kota, now taller than Jake's shoulder, went on all fours and padded silently to him, sensing what others couldn't yet accept. He lay down beside Rex and did not move. Even as the sun dipped behind the hills, the dogs gathered. Scout curled. Buddy licked Rex's nose. Jake watched from the steps, hands clenched. When the old shepherd gave his last breath, it was quiet and full of peace. But then came a sound none had heard before. A deep, aching note. Not a bark, not a growl, not a howl. A lament. Mournful and raw, it rose from Kota's chest and wove through the falling snow like something ancient and formless. Jake would later say it was the sound of a soul breaking and reshaping at the same time. Kota stayed by Rex's grave for 2 days. He did not eat. He did not play. On the third morning, he stood and walked slowly to the field where Scout and Buddy waited near a group of new arrivals, a pair of nervous pups and a young fox. Kota didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just sat down beside them. And in that moment, the pack shifted. A new leader had risen, not out of dominance, but out of love. Weeks later, when a new orphan bear cub arrived, shivering and alone, Kota approached without sound. He did not wag. He did not roll over. He simply lay down and nudged forward a chewed tennis ball. The cub looked at him, blinked, then pawed the ball hesitantly. And with that single gesture, Kota, once the cub who believed he was a boy, passed on the lesson that had shaped his life. Family doesn't need to be of the same species, only the same heart. Snow fell gently over the ranch that winter, soft and endless, blanketing every field and tree in a hush that felt reverent, as though the land itself understood the quiet miracle unfolding within its fences. Life inside the sanctuary pulsed with warmth despite the cold. Fires crackled in the main lodge, where volunteers gathered to write reports and sip coffee. Kennels lined with straw offered comfort to newly rescued dogs. Dens dug near the woods provided a safe space for bear cubs finding their footing between instinct and nurture. At the heart of it all was Kota. Once a terrified cub on the edge of death, now a massive, gentle force of unity. He moved through the ranch like a guardian spirit, every step slow and mindful, his presence enough to settle even the most nervous of new arrivals. To the mash, he was pack leader, stepping into the role once held by Rex with grace and quiet command. Scout deferred to him with subtle respect. Buddy, older now and slightly slower, often leaned against him in the afternoons as they watched the horizon together. The younger rescues, Canine and Ursine, followed him with the unspoken trust that comes only when love is proven through action. Kota had become something that defied easy explanation, a bridge between worlds, bearing both bark and growl in equal measure. His days were filled with moments that stitched together his identity. Greeting the mailman with a soft bark and bowed, had to accept the usual biscuit. Teaching a skittish black bear cub how to dig a winter den by example. Playing fetch with Scout until the snow was marked with bounding prints. Curling into the hay beside a traumatized hound who wouldn't sleep. Alone. He no longer needed to choose between the bear he was born as and the dog he had been raised to be. He simply was both. There was no manual on how to lead a sanctuary of misfits and orphans, but Kota did it not with rules or roars, but with empathy. Like when a young golden retriever trembled at the scent of a wild animal, Kota approached with slow, deliberate gentleness, letting the dog sniff his fur, his breath slow and warm, until the fear faded. When a newly orphaned bear cub cried out at night, Kota would pad over, lie beside them, and press his thick shoulder against theirs until sleep returned. The animals taught each other more than humans ever could, and Kota remained at the center, not because he demanded it, but because he deserved it. Jake, watching it all unfold, found himself changed too. His life, once solitary and silent, was now woven with purpose. He worked from dawn to dusk, maintaining the grounds, feeding the animals, and talking with visitors who came from farther and farther away just to witness what love had built. He often stood on the porch at dusk, sipping coffee gone cold, eyes fixed on the field where Kota lumbered through the snow, flanked by a dog on one side and a bear cub on the other. He was never meant to just be a bear, Jake once said to Dr. Chen, his voice rough with emotion. He was meant to remind us that love can rewrite instinct. Dr. Chen, who had once warned about identity confusion and the risks of imprinting, now spent her weekends volunteering at the sanctuary. She no longer questioned Kota's identity. She celebrated it. Then came a moment that sealed Kota's place, not just in Jake's life, but in the lives of all who believed in miracles. A girl arrived, small, thin, her face drawn with the weight of a burden too old for her age. Her name was Lucy. Her trauma had locked her voice in silence. She hadn't spoken since the accident that claimed her parents and left her in the care of distant relatives. She was terrified of animals, especially large ones, and refused to go near the sanctuary grounds. Until one day, she saw Kota playing fetch. He wasn't chasing the ball exactly, more like bumbling after it with exaggerated clumsiness, his paws too big for the act, his rear wagging in wide sways. He rolled over after catching it, sprawled in the snow like a lazy rug, and let out a high-pitched, completely off-rhythm howl. Lucy giggled. It was soft, so soft her aunt barely heard it. But Kota did. His ears perked. He turned his head slowly, met her gaze, then padded gently toward the fence. He stopped 10 feet away, sat down, and lowered his head. No sound. No movement. Just presence. Lucy stepped forward. She didn't speak, but her hand touched the wood of the fence. Kota responded by lying down and nudging a tennis ball toward her with his snout. She reached down and picked it up. From that day on, she returned every afternoon. Slowly, she inched closer. One day, she sat beside him, silent and still. Another, she brushed his thick fur with a soft bristled comb. And one snowy morning, as Kota dropped the ball at her feet, she whispered again. It was the first word she'd spoken in a year. From that moment forward, her words returned like birds to spring. Her therapist called it unprecedented. Her aunt called it divine. Jake just smiled and looked at the bear who never once left her side. The legend of the bear who thought he was a dog began to spread. Beyond the county, beyond the state. Carried on social media, whispered at vet clinics, shared in classrooms and therapy circles. But those who came seeking spectacle found something quieter, deeper, a lesson in coexistence, in patience, in what it means to love something enough to meet it where it is, not where you expect it to be. Visitors often paused at the bronze plaque near the main gate, placed beneath a carved likeness of Kota's broad, wise face, and read the inscription Jake had written with shaking hands the day the sanctuary received its non-profit status. Family. Doesn't need to be of the same species, only the same heart. The snow fell heavier that year, but no one minded. Inside the sanctuary, fires burned warm. Dogs barked joyfully. Bear cubs wrestled in the drifts. And at the center of it all was Kota, watching, guiding, healing, and every so often howling off-key into the wind with a wag of his whole hind end.